Welcome, everyone. My name is Kate Lindsay. I'm the Senior Vice President at the Forest Products Association of Canada, FPAC, and we're very pleased to welcome you today to our very first policy webinar. We are very fortunate to have extremely knowledgeable and thoughtful experts joining us today to discuss ways that Canada can shift from reactive wildfire response to a greater role in active prevention and mitigation, what policies and programs are needed to scale mitigation and strengthen resilience, and practical solutions such as modeling, fuel treatments, Indigenous-led fire management, and place-based knowledge mobilization. This session is for policymakers, regulators, rights holders, stakeholders across forest management, climate resilience, emergency preparedness, and public safety. So to set some context for today's webinar, Canada's wildfire seasons are growing longer and larger and more concerning. In 2025 alone, more than 6,000 wildfires burned over 8.3 million hectares across nearly every province and territory, an area more than 720 times the size of Vancouver, and forcing over 85,000 people to evacuate, including 45,000 from 73 First Nations. Wildfires now cost Canada over $1 billion a year in firefighting, plus at least $500 million in damages, disruptions, and rebuilding. Figures that skyrocket during major events, like the $3.8 billion Fort McMurray fire and the $1.3 billion Jasper fire. The impacts ripple far beyond burned landscapes. Wildfire smoke cost Ontario residents $1.28 billion in health impacts in just 5 days in 2025, while Fort McMurray shut down oil sands production by 1 million barrels per day, 45 million in lost revenue every day. As fires grow larger and more severe, these cascading human, economic, and environmental costs are no longer exceptional. They are becoming the norm. Today's webinar is about what happens next. As wildfire risks escalate, the cost of inaction is rising just as fast, threatening Canada's economy, public health, communities, and natural systems. This discussion brings together leading experts to identify those risks clearly and to outline the policy choices available now that can shift us from reactive response to proactive wildfire management. And by the end of the session, we hope participants will leave with greater knowledge and practical policy measures that support active forest management, reduce wildfire impacts, and strengthen Canada's long-term resilience. And before diving into our first presenter, I will introduce a very special guest. We have with us today Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources and Member of Parliament for Calgary Confederation, Corey Hogan. And I will pass the mic over to you, Parliamentary Secretary, to say a few words. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Kate. Thanks for the intro. I also know that my friend and MP colleague Gord Johns is here, true champion of forest communities. So great to have so many good minds together in this space for this webinar here. So I just want to thank you all and acknowledge at the start that I'm speaking from the traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm myself from Treaty 7 territory, but I'm coming at you live from Ottawa, as live as Ottawa can ever get. And look, last year was a really challenging wildfire year for Canada. Across the country, communities faced prolonged evacuations. People lost homes and livelihoods. People lost their lives. And this impact, it really underscores the hard truth. Canadians do recognize that wildfire it's a continuous threat and it's a growing threat. And wildfires are becoming more intense and more complex. And as the risk grows, so does the importance of all of us working together across provinces, across territories, with Indigenous partners, local authorities, industry, and yes, the government of Canada too, because wildfire risk in Canada is not a seasonal issue anymore, and it's not an environmental issue alone. It's a public safety issue. It's a health issue. It's an economic issue. And increasingly, it's a national resilience and security issue too. And I think that's something that we need to think long and hard about. So for decades, much of Canada's forest policy has been oriented towards ensuring sustainable harvest while also meeting conservation objectives. And those remain critical goals, but no longer sufficient on their own to address the current risk to the environment. Forests they're becoming more fire prone due to accumulated fuel loads from decades of suppression, from intensifying climate stress, and the continued expansion of the wildland urban interface. And that's increasing exposure of communities and infrastructure. And that means active forest management needs to be on the table here. And that's deliberately intervening in systems to reduce risk before wildfires start or escalate. And to be clear, it's not about eliminating fire. It's about bringing fire back into balance on our terms, not under crisis conditions. So the case for active forest management is fundamentally a national one, in my opinion. More Canadians are living in fire-prone areas than ever before. Without proactive risk reduction, we're placing communities in these perpetual cycles of evacuation, loss, and rebuilding. Active forest management practices can support public safety and they can support community resilience. And Kate talked about the wildfire in Fort McMurray. Obviously, as an Albertan, that hits very close to home. But it's not just Fort McMurray. There's a lot of places where wildfires are disrupting forest sector, energy systems, transportation corridors, insurance markets. They're threatening fiber and timber supply. They're increasing costs. They're increasing volatility across all sorts of sectors, not just forest sectors. Logging roads are mining roads, and active forest management helps stabilize systems. It protects jobs and it protects long-term economic stability. And the evidence is increasingly clear. Every dollar invested in prevention and mitigation is saving us multiple dollars in response and recovery. And at the same time, advancing wildfire risk reduction through active forest management creates economic opportunities for the forest sector, in particular by supporting sustainable fiber supply, enabling biomass utilization, and it can strengthen long-term sector competitiveness. Indigenous fire stewardship has been shaping landscapes for millennia, and expanding cultural burnings and Indigenous-led management is not only a matter of reconciliation, but it's a critical component of effective active forest management that restores ecosystem resilience and it reduces fuel loads. And so this is an area where Canada can lead globally by supporting Indigenous-led approaches as a core component of active forest management and wildfire reduction. And finally, I just want to say climate adaptation and international leadership has to be discussed. Canada is not alone in facing these challenges. By advancing active forest management, Canada has an opportunity to shape global approaches to integrated fire management. So, I would say that the question is not whether Canada can afford to invest in active forest management, it's whether we can afford not to. Active forest management gives us pathways to move from a reactive system to proactive, risk-informed one. It allows us to protect communities, allows us to strengthen our economy. It upholds Indigenous leadership, and it positions Canada as a global leader in wildfire resilience. So the federal government supports provinces, territories, and Canadians in times of emergency, and we help them recover afterwards. But we're also investing in building greater national resilience to wildfire in the first place by advancing science and making strategic investments before disaster strikes. Wildfire risk reduction is ultimately most effective when governments and the forest sector work together as partners, sharing responsibility for sustainable forest management. So I just want to thank you all for taking the time today. Thank you to Forest Products Association of Canada for convening us all and fostering this important discussion. And thank you. It will help keep our communities safer and it will strengthen our collective resilience. The conversations like conversations today literally save lives. Merci. Thank you.
Yes, welcome everyone. And it's so encouraging to see so many of you on this webinar today. And for those here on live and for those watching in the future on a recording here. So welcome. Thank you again to the Forest Products Association of Canada for hosting this webinar, and to Kate Lindsay for the welcoming of Parliamentary Secretary Hogan to the discussion. Corey, I'm really encouraged to hear your words around, it's not a seasonal or environmental issue anymore. This is a full year initiative today, and it's bringing fire back into balance. That's a really good point that you've made there. And of course, underscoring the importance of our Indigenous fire stewardship and cultural burning. It's not a global issue, or it's now a global issue too. And that, active forest management is going to play a key role in this. And again, we are global thought leaders in this. So thank you again. My name is Garnet Muro. I'm speaking to you today from the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc Traditional Territory, also known as Kamloops, British Columbia. I am the Executive Director for the Wildfire Resilience Consortium of Canada, the WRCC. At the WRCC, we look to connect this vast web of folks in this wildfire conversation, much like what we're doing here today on this webinar. And as we work together, and as Kate noted, we want to shift Canada from, that reactive wildfire response to a prevention first mitigation and management style. And that just serves the whole of society here in Canada. So it's my pleasure today to be your moderator for this important topic of shared risk, shared solutions, and the future of wildfire. Our lineup of speakers will be as follows. Kicking us off will be Kelsey Winter. Kelsey is the Executive Director of the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre. She will be framing suppression to systems transformation in wildfire management. Next, we'll hear from Jen Beverly, Associate Professor, Department of Renewable Resources, University of Alberta. Jen will be highlighting modeling frameworks and tools for informing strategic wildfire mitigation. Following Jen will be Jason Fisher. Jason is the Executive Director for the Forest Enhancement Society of British Columbia. He will be talking about policy levers that the federal government can use to support the delivery of wildfire risk reduction and activities across the provinces and territories. And then finally bringing us home will be Dane D'Souza. Dane is a Senior Policy Advisor for Emergency Management at the Métis National Council and an Indigenous Fire Stewardship Researcher. Dane will be sharing some background on Indigenous fire stewardship and innovative pathways to scaling Indigenous fire stewardship. Following their presentations, we'll be looking at a roughly 10 minutes of question and answer. So please do ask your questions in the chat below or in the Q&A box below. And, please remember to put what individual you'd like the question to go to, and then we'll address it to them. We may not get to all of your questions today, but in which case our presenters have committed to giving some answers back to Forest Products Association of Canada, and FPAC will come back to you with the questions. So, Kelsey Winter, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Garnet. Someone give me a hands up or a thumbs up and let me know you can see my screen, hopefully. All right. Thanks again to FPAC for the invitation. I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking people. So today recognized by the Songhe and the Esquimalt nations, that places me in what is now called Victoria, British Columbia, my piece of Turtle Island. For me, this acknowledgement is a reminder that wildfire and land stewardship exist within systems that have often excluded Indigenous knowledge and governance despite millennia of stewardship. So as we look ahead, and that's one of the themes today, part of our responsibility is ensuring that those systems evolve so that Indigenous leadership and knowledge are not peripheral but central. So my piece today is about wildfire and policy in the world outside operations, and how the systems that we've built, particularly around coordination and prevention, need to evolve as well to meet that growing demand. So we're all seeing the same trends. I know we'll hear a bit more about this today, and Kate started with this change as well, but fire seasons we see now 30 to 50 days longer than they were a few decades ago. You hear 2023 talked about a lot, over 18 million hectares burnt, 6 times the historical average. I think the critical point for the audience today, particularly in policy, is that reflects increasing hazard, but not inevitability. Because these outcomes, as Parliamentary Secretary Hogan chatted about as well, they're shaped by how we manage landscapes, about how we build communities, and how prepared our systems are. So 2 communities that are facing the same fire can have very different outcomes, depending on whether homes are built with defensible space, whether fuel has been managed around the community, whether evacuation routes and planning are in place. So they're not environmental differences, they're policy and planning decisions. We do in Canada have a collaborative wildfire system. One example is through CIFC, so province and territories sharing resources, coordinating fire smart programming, supporting one another when capacity is exceeded. But that system, while it works, it is being tested. So the question we're facing now, and what many of the presenters will address today, is how the risk is increasing and how we can influence what happens when that risk materializes. If we frame wildfire as a climate problem, it can feel distant, uncontrollable. But when we frame it as a systems and a policy problem, it becomes actionable. So those are some of the solutions we'll focus on today. Why I so appreciate FPAC putting this webinar together. It means that decisions that we make in this room, in your rooms, about land use, about forestry practices, infrastructure, investment, those aren't peripheral to wildfire outcomes. They're very central to them. So why prevention matters? A prevention-first approach is about shaping fire before it becomes catastrophic. And the evidence is clear. I mean, it depends on which study you read, but we see every dollar invested in mitigation saving $3 to $6 in response and recovery. Fire smart homes, 90% more likely to survive. And at a practical level, that looks like requiring fire smart standards in new development, supporting retrofits in existing communities, investing in fuel reduction around high-risk areas. And they're proven approaches, but they only scale when they're backed by policy and funding. And that directly translates into safer conditions for our firefighters, fewer catastrophic losses, and lower suppression costs. And these approaches, again, only scale when we can embed them in policy through planning and building standards and sustained investment. Importantly, prevention is also where we see the greatest opportunity for alignment across sectors, more stability, fewer disruptions, and some more predictable operating environments. Wildfire, what we're seeing today, it's not just climate, it's the result, and I know this is something many of us will talk about today, but it's the result of policy choices. So we see area burned tenfold since the 1970s, suppression costs, Kate shared, like exceeding $1 billion annually, continuing to rise. And historically, we focused on suppression that contributed to the accumulation and the burnable landscapes, the intensity fires. That's accumulated risk. And the systems we built for that different risk environment are now under strain. So the question is, one of the questions, how quickly can policy evolve to match today's reality? So if we accept that wildfire is a policy challenge, what does that mean in practice? And I'm sure the incredible speakers in this lineup are going to touch on some of the points, but just to get us started, land use and community planning, for example, limiting development in the highest risk areas or requiring wildfire resilient design standards in new builds, ensuring we're not continuing to expand risk in high exposure areas without built-in mitigation, incentives and requirements for that mitigation, scaling approaches around communities in community forests, ensuring that those measures are not optional, but they're expected and they're supported, and then long-term forecast and landscape management as well. So enabling that healthy fire and fuel management and species diversification so that we can reduce that risk over time. I know none of these are new ideas. The challenge is just enabling them consistently and at scale through policy. So we do have the tools to change the trajectory. I don't need to tell you about the research that has shown that if we're actively managing our forests, we experience lower fire severity. The challenge, again, adaptation takes time, and the decisions we make today are not going to make an impact today. They're going to shape fire behavior decades from now. So the real gap, not being one of just knowledge, but in implementation. So to close that gap, we need regulatory clarity, aligned incentives, and some ability to move collaboratively from pilots to scale. And that's, I think, where policy is critical, because scaling requires long-term commitment and coordination. One of our greatest strengths in Canada, if I may be so bold, is the collaborative wildfire system that we have. And CIFC is fortunate enough to be part of that system. So provinces and territories really retain jurisdiction over wildfire management. But increasingly, as we see even with 2025, no single jurisdiction has the capacity to manage these extreme seasons alone. So CIFC exists to bridge some of that gap, coordinate resources nationally, move to where support is needed the most. And that allows us to scale responses without centralizing control. And that kind of coordination is what helps the system function, but also under increasing strain, as our fire seasons overlap globally as well as domestically, the ability to rely on external support diminishes. The role of the federal government is not to replace that authority, but enable it the way they do through funding, coordination, policies that support interoperability and that shared capacity. And then the role of provinces and territories then to implement and to regulate and scale that mitigation within their jurisdictions. And when those roles align, that federal role and that provincial and territorial role, the system works. And when they are not aligned, that's when we see gaps emerge. So the challenge is ensuring our system remains resilient, not just under average conditions, but under this sustained, concrete, concurrent pressure. So I'm going to close coming back to where I started. 2023, 18 million hectares, 2025, second worst season on record. Not just statistics, those are signals, signals that risk is increasing, that our systems are under pressure, that our current approaches are not enough. Wildfire outcomes in Canada are shaped by the policy choices we make, where we build, how we manage landscapes, what we choose to invest in. So whether we invest in mitigation today or continue to absorb growing suppression and recovery costs tomorrow, we can't control the weather, but we can absolutely control how prepared we are for it. And I think that's where leadership like those people that are in this room today come in, because the decisions we make now will define what future fire seasons look like in Canada. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Kelsey. Next. Jen, thank you. And Jen, we're looking at your slide deck versus the presentation mode. Got it. Okay, the floor is yours, Jen, and just you're on mute still.
Sorry, are you able to hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, my apologies.
Presenter mode.
Gotcha. All right. Thanks, Garnet. Thanks for the introduction. Sorry about those little tech issues, but let's get started. So I'm going to follow now to dive right into some modeling tools and techniques that are available for informing those strategic interventions that are so important and in the direction that we're trying to move. When I talk about those strategic interventions, mitigation actions, the key question is, well, when do we do it, where do we do it, and how do we do it? And I like to group it into two main types of activities. So on the top, what we hear a lot about, fuel management, and that includes modifying stand structure, fire smart treatments around communities where the stand is being thinned and the lower limbs are being removed and other surface fuels are being removed to reduce the flammability and next to the built environment across landscapes, disrupting that fuel continuity with anthropogenic disturbances that are hoped that's going to create disruptions to the possible fire pathways moving across landscapes, and also prescribed burning, and that could be for restoration purposes or cultural burning practices or fuel hazard burning as well. And then on the bottom, I have another set of activities that are also strategic interventions that I think are really important. Hardening assets, we often see the home in this box, but I think more importantly, even you got to consider critical infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, power lines. When those go down, it can lead to catastrophes. Planning in advance for the evacuations that are sometimes inevitable, and as well, planning for tactical action. And you can pre-plan for example, ignition operations. If you know the prominent fire pathways for a fire to move into an area, you can look at that strategically in advance to identify where tactically you might have an opportunity to ignite and burn out to try to stop an intense fire when that's the only option. So the kinds of models that are available to inform those kinds of mitigations are really looking at the hazard. So when we mitigate, we're trying to address and target the hazard. So what is the hazard that we're targeting? And the models really fall out into two kinds of groups. So the first one is where we consider the fire itself the hazard. And that's an integrated modeling approach where the fuel and the weather and the ignitions are all considered collectively together. And we're looking at that integrated expression of a fire spreading and burning, and things like intensity and rates of spread are all part of that. So modeling the individual fire as an integrated process. The other way of thinking about the hazard is the precipitating factors. So you can also consider the hazard, the fuel hazard, decoupled from the weather hazard, decoupled from the ignition hazard. And when you look at those individual components, you're going to learn maybe different things. A key part of the decoupling process is it allows you to partition the things that you can know with some certainty, which is the fuel hazard. You can map that, doesn't change dramatically from year to year, versus the weather and the ignition hazard, which is highly variable within a fire season, but also through time. So these have lots of predictive uncertainty. When they're all modeled together as an integrated process, when you're modeling fire as an integrated fire hazard, then that uncertainty is embedded within those models. When you decouple it, you can look at them separately. And the approach on the right is the one that I advocate for, and I'll show you some examples of why I think it's valuable. But there's lots of models out there that use that integrated approach as well. So here's a comparison of the integrated approach to looking at fuel and weather and ignitions all together by spreading and growing fires and focusing on the integrated process of a fire as the hazard. That's on the left. On the right is looking just at the fuel. So this is, hey, I'm considering the hazard. If there's hazardous fuel around me, I'm concerned about that. And let's look at some differences between these two approaches. In particular, Atlantic Canada comes out strong. And it should be obvious to everyone why that doesn't have a really high burn probability or lots of concern from this integrated approach, because it's based on what's happened in the past. So those models have to be calibrated from historical conditions, historical climate conditions, historical ignition activity. And there just hasn't been a ton of fires in this region of the country historically compared to other parts of the country. That doesn't mean it's not possible. And we know there's been large catastrophic fires in Atlantic Canada historically, but it's long ago before the data was available for any modeling. So when you look at the right map, you can see there's a ton of fuel there. That means if you do get a drought in this area, if you do get the ignitions, if you do get that conducive fire weather, you can have very destructive fires in this part of the country. If you're considering, though, tying it to historical data and historical landscapes and historical climate, you might conclude that it's not too much of a problem. So you're going to get very different results in terms of the modeling paradigms you're choosing. I focus on the fuel hazard because I think we have a ton of uncertainty into the future about climate change and about what could happen. This is just a difference between the map. Now, there's also another group of models that I can't highlight because they're proprietary solutions. And you don't really know exactly what the methods are. There's been a proliferation of for-profit companies out there offering what they're calling hazard and risk assessment maps to inform strategic mitigations. They're charging a lot of money and they're probably making a good money from it. But I would say proceed with caution when you're looking at those proprietary solutions. If they're not peer-reviewed, open, and transparent about the methods, then you don't really know what's going on. But they do tend to fall mostly within that fire hazard box, modeling fire as an integrated process. So when you use the simple approach, you might think that's limited, but we've done some neat things with it to make it accessible and to help inform those mitigations. This is an example from Jasper. So we actually published this paper the year before the Jasper fire, and we had flagged Jasper as one of the most directionally vulnerable communities in the province of Alberta. And in this case, it's pretty obvious because you have valleys that channel fire towards the town. In other places, though, these graphs can be very informative in places where it's maybe not so obvious. Why do you want to map the directional vulnerability? And this is just based on that underlying exposure map, which is just based on the fuels. Well, it tells you where you might want to try to cut off those pathways. And that could be with any of those strategic interventions that I reviewed. So it could be with fuel management, or it could be to look at ignition operations strategically, and so on. And so we've run these assessments in communities across Canada, in Ontario, in BC, in Alberta, in Northwest Territories. They're being used in Quebec. They're also being used internationally in Alaska, in Australia, and in Europe and elsewhere. So they've really gotten a lot of traction. These are the kinds of assessment products that come out of each of these community scale assessments, and they can be applied broadly across landscapes. In this case, this is the town of Canmore. And you can see that we've been able to identify prominent fire pathways into the community. And we've also mapped those in relation to landscape scale fuel management, as well as those purple areas as fuel management in and around the town. And we can clip it to the buildings in the town and show on individual streets where there's exposure, but that can guide prioritization and optimization of fuel management activities, and exploring also plans for evacuations. We've also applied it to assess those telecommunications infrastructure, so critical infrastructure where you might want to try to harden assets with generators to keep telecommunication towers running, for example. Well, where do you do that? Where do you prioritize? You can't do it everywhere. In this study, we assessed all the telecommunications infrastructure in the province of Alberta. We identified all the roads that are highly exposed and have no cell phone coverage, as well as recreational trails. And so that can be used to prioritize where you might take those landscape scale and more local scale interventions. And we also produce software so that it can be accessible, and that's a key piece that sometimes is missing. But my PhD student, Air Forbes, has created an R package. We've been teaching people how to use them, practitioners in governments and municipalities and researchers, as well as consultancies. And so making the tools available to implement these assessments has been a key part of the process. And I'll close it off there. And I know there's been a movement there to cancel Smokey, but I think there's still a good message there. Thank you for listening. And I've just noted some key supporters of our research there at the bottom.
Thank you, Jen. Some really good research you're doing there, especially around that community exposure and vulnerability. So well done. Jason, over to you.
Won't let me start my video for some reason. I don't know if someone else has to do that for me or not.
That's a good question. Oh, there you're on.
There you go.
We see you.
Now you're going to wish you'd turn it off again. Hi, everyone. I'm trying to get this in presenter mode here so I can actually see what's going on in addition to showing you my slides. That should work there, but it isn't for some reason. All right, can you guys see my slides now? A little thumbs up would be great.
Yes, you've got it.
Okay, great.
Off and running.
So I'm Jason Vischer. I am talking to you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Lheidli in Prince George, British Columbia. I'm very happy to be joining you from across Canada. I maybe made the mistake of looking at the list of people who are actually attending the call. Glad to see lots of friends on there. I don't know whether that lowers the pressure or raises the pressure for me. But I'm glad to be here to talk to you today about where I think some opportunities are for the federal government to support wildfire risk reduction that's taking place right across the country and all the provinces and territories. Just briefly, the Forest Enhancement Society of BC, we've been around for 10 years now, established in 2016. We're primarily funded by the BC Ministry of Forests. Our program is applicant driven, so we rely on people coming to us to identify those opportunities to increase wildfire resilience in their communities and areas. Between 2016 and 2025, our funding has supported the treatment of 18,000 hectares of wildfire risk reduction activities and another 12,000 hectares of prescriptions. And that sounds like a lot, but it's humbling when you see some of those other stats and realize that that's about 0.1% of what has burned in some of the historic fire seasons that we've had lately. But it's not just about the amount of hectares that's treated, it's where those hectares are treated. And I'm happy to say that our organization and the treatments that we've funded have impacted over 70 First Nations and 170 communities across BC impacted positively. I want to show you this slide. This is from my friend Tony Pescovitz at the BC Wildfire Service. It's a conceptual slide. You maybe say, this is an official dogma from Wildfire Service, but I think it's really important to think about what we're trying to achieve when it comes to a whole of society approach, and why really a networked approach to the challenge met by wildfire or created by wildfire is critical. These are links in a chain. And the Forest Enhancement Society, we operate most extensively in the interface. We work with partners like FireSmart that's working in the communities, and then of course we're working with scientists and the wildfire services and all the other organizations at the landscape level. And I think that what I want you to take from this slide is thinking about where in this network potentially you or your organization fits, where you can make the biggest difference. But recognize also that you can't do it alone. So if we spend all of our time in the defensible spaces around the community, but we're not treating the community itself to make it more resilient, we haven't actually achieved our objectives. And likewise, if we're forgetting about the landscape, if we're putting all of our interests into the community, into the interface, this slide here, speaks to the impacts of fires and the harm caused by fire. But of course, it doesn't matter where a fire occurs. The smoke that's generated by the fire can create unwanted impacts for communities at a great distance from where those fires actually occur. So when we're thinking about policy, when we're thinking about wildfire, we have to think about this as being a networked response and a whole of society approach that scales up from the local to the landscape. And there are a lot of people working in this space to network with, and I think that's part of the good news to come out of this today. We're not talking about a blank slate to work with. These are just some examples of some of the folks, some of the organizations that are in this space, and it stems from the national and provincial programs like FireSmart, FSBC, FRIA in Alberta. We have our neighbors to the south, Blue Forest in California, the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, as examples of U.S. programs that are in this space. There are funders, philanthropic organizations like the Nature Conservancy, which operates in Canada as Nature United, the McCall-McBain Foundation, operating primarily out of Ontario, I believe, that are working in this space as well. And why is it important that we have so many players? Because whenever we're talking about forestry, we're talking about place-based activity. Following the previous presentation, each community has a thumbprint. Each forest has a unique thumbprint as it relates to what is the conditions of the forest around that community, what are the unique vulnerabilities and opportunities in relation to that community. And so by building these networks, we are going to be able to build trust at the grassroots. We're going to be able to activate those local consultants and contractors that know the area, that have the equipment, that have the experience, that have the relationships, that are going to be able to make sure that the work is done, and that ideally the right work is done at the right place and the right scale. Whenever we're looking at setting up these programs for wildfire risk reduction, we face some challenges. And one of those challenges is consistent funding. So it is great when funding opportunities come and we can make the most of them. But if the funding isn't consistent, we don't have that ability to build that capacity to put the work in front of the private sector so that they can continue to acquire the equipment and develop the skills and training necessary to be able to build this momentum, to be able to carry the work forward. It's important to think about the work that we're doing in the wildfire risk reduction space as an investment. These are not fire and forget activities. You cannot treat a landscape once and then expect it to stay done. Trees and shrubs and forbs have this habit of growing back. And so whenever we've made this investment, the question is, are we thinking far enough ahead to know that we've got a plan to come back and retreat that in that 7 to 10 years so that the investment that we made will pay dividends in the long run? Again, based on the last presentation, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that not only that we have good data, but that data is publicly available and shared so that we have a common understanding. This is a place where the strength comes from sharing knowledge, not from putting it behind walls. I support that notion wholeheartedly. And if we're operating from a common set of data, we're more likely to be able to come up with the plans and opportunities to develop that whole of society approach to working from the community to the landscape level and thinking about how we change the circumstances, the conditions to improve the impacts that we're expected to see from wildfire. So where can federal policy make a difference? You could spend more than the whole of the time that we have together talking about each of these areas, but it's important to recognize that each level of government in Canada has a different set of jurisdictional priorities and ability to operate, and so it's always important to think about where are the levers that can actually be pulled by each level of government. And again, it's not going to be the action of any one level of government or any one organization. It's going to be the impacts that are created through the networking of those different opportunities that are going to have the biggest impact overall. But when I kind of look across the landscape of federal jurisdiction and some of the existing programs, the areas where I think we're making a huge difference and can potentially increase the impact. One of those is remote sensing. So NRCan and the Canadian Space Agency are doing some amazing work in relation to using satellites. I think that there's an opportunity to perhaps jump over LiDAR acquisition as being the primary source of high quality information, and thinking about how do we combine satellite imagery with local drone technology to have a much more comprehensive and detailed understanding of the conditions of the forests that we're looking to try and treat from a wildfire risk reduction perspective. Energy policy is another area where the federal government can play a big role. Thinking about biomass for community heat and power is an opportunity to think about where that continued maintenance will come from. How do we defray some of the costs associated with that maintenance? I'd be remiss not to note that the tax credit incentive for biomass energy assets is a huge step forward, and thanks to the federal government for making that initiative possible. But there is most of the cost is actually in the operation of these plants and the acquisition of biomass. Just because it's not high value timber doesn't mean it's inexpensive to develop, move, and process. And so operational costs associated with these plants, we need to give that more consideration. There is a huge funding role, again, that multi-year coordinated funding focused on operational activities. That is what's going to allow the investments to be made in equipment, in know-how, in training to continue the work into the future. Supporting research is another critical role for the federal government. The effectiveness of treatments is something that is being explored extensively in British Columbia and elsewhere. In each of the universities in the province, I think right now has someone working on looking at where how do we measure the impact that we're having in the activities that we're undertaking? How do we make those activities more effective and efficient? And how do we maintain, looking at cultural fire, prescribed fire, creating, as my friend Sonia Leverkis talks about, fire absorbent landscapes, as opposed to thinking about just the risk reduction. How do we make sure that fires, when they occur in a good way, and in a way that doesn't have the unintended consequences that we're experiencing annually now. National model codes is another area where the federal government can play a role. That was already mentioned, I think, by Kelsey, talking about is there an opportunity to think about what a fire-hardened, fire-smart development in the WUI looks like? I hope so. That would be great. And then the final area just to mention today is really around carbon and health policy. And it's not that there's necessarily policies within these areas that are going to drive the work that we're doing, but if we're thinking about how we can have the biggest impact in relation to carbon and health policy, certainly when we're thinking about emissions from wildfire and the impact of reducing risk on the landscape from wildfire, these become levers to pull to say that this is an investment worth making in wildfire risk reduction. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. I'll pass it back to Garnet.
Thank you very much, Jason.
Sharing.
So many good things that your program's been up to for many years, and I've had the good fortune of working with your organization for a lot of years too. So thank you. So next, and just as a quick reminder, we're going to bring up Dane next. But while Dane's getting ready, just a quick reminder that if you do have questions for our presenters, please do put them in the Q&A box down below, and we'll start taking questions right after Dane's presentation. So Dane, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Garnet, and just like to extend some thanks to the FPAC team and my fellow presenters today for this opportunity. It's very exciting to be here today. So I got a lot to cover in about 10 minutes here, so I'm just going to take note of the time, but I'm going to start just kind of giving a bit of an overview of Indigenous fire stewardship, which is my area of expertise, and it's a bit tricky to get 500,000 years of history into 10 minutes here, but I'll do my best. If somebody can just send a thumbs up in the chat that my screen is visible, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, you're good.
Fantastic. That's a lot of thumbs up. Very attentive. I love it. So what makes us as humans able to live everywhere from Africa, where our genesis starts, to Australia, to Canada, down to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina, is as humans, we modify our environments to suit our needs. In a modern context, we build cities with infrastructure. In historical contexts, we've developed agriculture and transferred and domesticated species across the planet to modify our environment to suit our needs. But the oldest way in which human beings have modified our environment to suit our needs is through fire. For about roughly 500,000 years, fire has been our bulldozer, our fertilizer, our wrangler. It's had a myriad of uses. For example, between Calgary and Banff, the Mountain Legacy Project has identified, last time I talked to them, roughly over 100 different uses for applying fire to the landscape in a pre-colonial context. So starting about 200 years ago, I believe 100 years ago, the first policies in Canada were passed banning applying fire to the land. And at that time, it was primarily Indigenous peoples taking part in their tradition and their cultural touchstone of applying good fire to the land. These policies weren't really enforceable until about the 1980s. And as was mentioned earlier, 1980s, 1970s is when we start to see things kind of start to change as far as the frequency and severity of wildfires in Canada. So if you picture the boreal forest as an ocean of trees, fire is like a wave coming through it. And as it consumes more trees, eventually it comes to the point where it's like an unstoppable tidal wave. So you can see these pictures in Jasper that I have here. And I'd like to make note of 1915 and take a minute to look at that landscape and look at the density of the forest. And then 100 years ago, or 100 years later, have a look at what Jasper looks like in 2019 with all that pine beetle kill and the density of the forest there. And then 2025, after the infamous Jasper fire, what things look like then. So that ocean of trees, as that fire comes through, it becomes, like I said, like an unstoppable force, a tidal wave. And I've seen it myself. If you look at the picture behind me, that is from the Chuck Egg fire in the high level area in 2019, I believe. And you'll note that that smoke is a very deep, dense copper color. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute here. But looking back at that 1915 picture, 8 years after the First Nations and Métis communities that were the original stewards of Jasper removed from the park, you can see that there's little islands in the forest. You know, there's little prairies that might have been burnt frequently and at regular intervals when the conditions are right to propagate grazing for bison and elk and other ungulates. There's maybe some portages through the forest to increase mobility upon the land. You could even have burns out there to bring back medicines and berries, but to ultimately modify that environment and maintain it. And Indigenous peoples have been doing that in Canada since the recession of the Laurentide ice sheet 14,000 years ago. So within the DNA of every tree, plant, and animal in Canada and North America is the memory of humans burning at regular intervals when the conditions are right for a myriad of reasons. So back to that ocean, when you have those little islands all throughout that ocean, that tidal wave comes through and it crashes upon the shores of those islands and archipelagos, and it loses energy and it becomes manageable. It becomes less intense and it doesn't have the impacts it currently does. So I spent 6 years as a wildland firefighter for the government of Alberta. My base was just down the road from Jasper in Rocky Mountain House District. And when you spend time with fire, you learn a lot about it. Even the way we talk about fire, it has agency. It dances, it runs, it crawls, it creeps, it jumps, it smolders. And you learn to use all of your senses to assess what a fire is doing. I can close my eyes and smell and taste a fire and tell you what's burning and how intensely it is. By the sound of the fire, I can tell you, is there moisture levels or rotted wood that's burning? But that copper smoke I referred to back there, as a wildland firefighter, you're taught and you learn to read smoke. So a white smoke has a lot of water vapor in it, and it's usually a bit cooler and less intense of a burn. A black smoke usually indicates that there's a lot of oil. So maybe it's a spruce stand going up in the pitch, and oils in the spruce needles are what's going into the atmosphere. Copper smoke means it's so intense that essentially the trees are evaporating and all organic materials are evaporating. If you've ever read the book Fire Weather by John Valant, they talk about a fire being discovered by NORAD outside of Cold Lake because they thought it was a nuclear impact because the fire was putting out the energy levels equivalent to nuclear blasts. There's no way to stop that. There's no shelter that can stop that. And when you have that copper smoke, you have to think about what's going into the atmosphere. The 2023 wildfire season that plagued Northwest Canada put more GHGs into the atmosphere than the entire global airline industry combined for that year. Everyone from Taylor Swift to a family going on vacation, more GHGs were put into the atmosphere, but they weren't accounted for. And if we're talking about climate change and how nervous we are about the impacts of climate change on wildfires, we might want to start taking seriously how we account for what are deemed as acts of God. So getting to solutions here. I've been working over the past several years with a number of organizations domestically and internationally to address the barriers that exist to putting good fire on the land. And the one I want to talk today about is the one that gives the most hope and opportunity and innovation. And it creates jobs, it creates opportunities for truth and reconciliation. But getting into that, I've been working with Blue Forest out of California or the United States, as was mentioned previously, to assess the possibility of scaling and implementing their forest resilience bonds in Canada. And what these bonds are, they're a bond, they're a financial tool that anyone can pay into. And it funds and diversifies funding to go do stewardship and ecologically beneficial activities like Indigenous fire stewardship. And after those activities are done, the benefits to different stakeholders and investors are assessed and then paid back out. So this enables long-term sustainable diversified funding to go do activities like Indigenous fire stewardship. Whereas right now, I mean, we're in May. Every May comes around, every March, I know I'm going to start being asked about wildfires, but it's a year-long activity is wildfire management. The term fire season really just refers to when provincial governments who have a monopoly on wildfire management, much like healthcare, start to offer contracts to wildland firefighters who work seasonally and have no job protections. And in the winter, they're doing any number of things, but not fighting, mitigating, or preventing fires when it's needed most. That term fire season doesn't mean when we need to start caring about fires, but there's no really benefit or political capital in preventing and mitigating fires throughout the winter. I mean, if you do the right thing and no one knows you did it, how do you get votes for it? And I would urge anybody on this call to be very, very critical of the next time you hear anyone say a wildfire or a wildfire season is unprecedented. Slave Lake, Fort Mac, Lytton, Los Angeles. I think that sets a precedence. But how do we build that political capital, whole of society buy-in, and that feel-good story? It's been done. In Australia, they have a system called carbon farming, and I've been working with an organization called the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, who helps build capacity in Indigenous communities to put their good fire back on the land, to take part in their traditional life ways, and to access carbon market funding to do so. So essentially what they do is they take a baseline of the carbon and GHG emissions of a forested landscape decaying, and then the different kind of outputs you can expect from fire behavior on that land. And that sets your baseline here. And then they go out and do what's called a cool burn or a traditional burn. It's just the same as our Indigenous fire stewardship in Canada. It's a burn that has that white smoke and it's low intensity. And as soon as the flames are out, you should be able to put your hand on the ground comfortably. And so those inherently have a lower emissions, lower GHG emissions, and they prevent getting to where that baseline is. They also reinvigorate growth and sequestration. So that gap there, you can then charge a carbon credit for, or sell a carbon credit for on the market. And as a resource extraction economy in Canada, carbon credits are very important for how we develop sustainable products, especially in the context of a world where we're trying to diversify our trade partners and market our natural resources with a urgency that I've never seen in my life. But what's more important than that is when it comes to truth and reconciliation in Canada, it's a very guilt-driven exercise. It's a bit odd that we'll take a lot of pride for the actions of Canada in World War II, despite none of us having been there. But when it comes to truth and reconciliation, you kind of get to a point in the conversation where the guilt and the shame becomes too much, and it's, well, that wasn't me, that wasn't my family, that was a long time ago. We need to start building pride in truth and reconciliation and buy-in. And I truly feel that Indigenous fire stewardship is what we can build that pride around. Fire gets people excited. It's fascinating. And the knowledge and science that is within Indigenous communities in Canada and Indigenous fire stewardships is something that everybody can be proud and excited about. It's like the haka. If you've ever watched a rugby game, you've seen the New Zealand All Blacks perform the haka, and whether they're in France or if they're in New Zealand, people stand up like it's a national anthem. They take pride in it and respect it. You have Maori and non-Maori folks performing the haka, and we need that in Canada. And what I've seen accomplished in Australia through this carbon farming system is you have folks who are in communities that are rural and there's not economic opportunity. They're very similar to the reservation systems and the rural realities of folks in Canada. And instead of having to leave their communities and leave their culture and go into the city and get an education or a job and try to find economic mobility, they are able to access non-government funding that has the benefit of lowering carbon emissions, but then goes directly in that community. So those young folks can revitalize their culture and their language and then put food on the table for their families in a dignified way. We're still working on how we might be able to get that here. And there's a lot of policy and buy-in that will need to be done to get us there. But I truly feel that Canada is in a position right now where we need the whole of society to not only secure our forests, but secure our socioeconomic well-being. And it's time that we start looking at the knowledge and the science and the understanding of this country prior to colonialism with pride and curiosity and whole society buy-in. So I thank you all very much for your time. I'm sorry if I did go a bit over there, but I'll toss it back to you, Garnet, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Well done, Dane, and thank you to all of our presenters today. At this point, we'll move into the question and answer phase. So maybe we have our presenters bring their cameras back on and mics live. I do have a question in the Q&A box here, and this one is for Dane. So come on back, Dane. I know you're in Mexico right now, so that's exciting too. All right, so Dane, Joshua wants to know, how do you picture Indigenous fire stewardship crews working to reduce fire risk in the off-season or early season? What can we do about insurance and liability for cultural and prescribed burns?
Yeah, so I think there's a really exciting opportunity. I appreciate this question. So if you have those Indigenous fire stewardship crews working year round, and as I mentioned, that fire season conundrum of only having provincial wildland firefighters be seasonal, what that has created is a huge experience strain in wildfire management. And you can count the cost of that in lives. When I got my training in wildfire in 2013, there was such a sense of pride in Canada that we hadn't lost a wildland firefighter in 20 years. And I was working in Alberta. And 3 or 4 years ago, we lost 9 folks in one season. And when I talk to my wildfire community, that's because we've lost experience. We've lost leaders, we've lost decision makers, and we have folks going out to respond to fires who've never even seen one before. And that is terrifying. So when you have those Indigenous fire stewardship crews working year round and collaborating with provincial wildfire forces to go out on the land, assess conditions, do exchanges of knowledge between the Western kind of training and the traditional knowledge and science, and then putting fire out on the land or taking part in forest thinning and fire smart projects, you get training, you get experience, you get retention, and you also get a safer, fire resilient forest and all those benefits of truth and reconciliation I mentioned. And when it comes to insurance and liability, I mentioned, where these fires occur, like Fort Mac, we don't really talk about, what it does when a fire shuts down a pipeline for 2-3 weeks. What's the cost of that? And how does that impact all the way from Fort Mac to Calgary to the trading floors in Toronto? What is the economic cost of that? We don't know. The only people who do know the economic costs of how we're mismanaging fires is the insurance industry, because that's the data you'll find is the insurance payouts and how that has impacted the insurance industry, which is a huge part of the Canadian GDP. What we can do with insurance is partner with insurance companies like they've done in California to offer prescribed burning insurance and liability insurance. Since there is that provincial monopoly, like you can't really get insurance or that at a reasonable level to go do burns. But beyond that, insurance companies can invest in the forest resilience bonds I mentioned earlier to not only save a return on investment, but then also to have a forest landscape that is more fire resilient and ultimately results in less payouts and less impacts to not only communities, but also to the profitability of the insurance industry. Also lowers the insurance premiums for folks living in the wildland urban interface. But yeah, I appreciate the question, Josh. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dane. That's a great response, and thank you for sharing that bit about the forest resilience bonds with the insurance sector. That's such a great idea, and I think it's also that's not a pilot that they're already doing things like that. So really good, and again, working towards that more resilient landscape. Okay, just looking at our other questions here. Thank you for these very interesting presentations. I work in a MP's office and I'm keen to hear what specifically you want to see from the federal government in terms of fire mitigation and response measures. The funding for water bombers in budget 2025 was a good first step, but what else is needed in terms of resource or legislation? So this isn't directed to anyone, but Kelsey Winter, possibly you want to speak to that one?
Because it said water bombers, that it gets thrown to me. It's a great question. I think one of the recommendations for sustained federal investment would be in that prevention and mitigation space, specifically investment that's designed to work with provincial and territorial systems, not around them. So in practical terms, something like stable funding for activities like FireSmart implementation or fuel management or community level risk reduction that Jason and Jen both talked about, because those are investments that reduce pressure on the entire system over time. And I think that there's a real role that the federal government could play in investment specifically in that space and in building the capacity that Dane talked about as well, so that over time, communities have the ability to, sustain their own prevention and mitigation programming. So, teaching a man to fish.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and that's a really good focus to move into that prevention mitigation side of things because again, once that fire is going, the bombers can only do so much, and we're not gonna paint our way out of this one. Okay, great. Thank you for that, Kelsey. We've got lots of time for questions here, so I'll keep going for another while. Okay, so Stephanie is asking, are there any resources that can be utilized to show governments the benefits of keeping crews year round? I live in the Northwest Territories, and most of our crews are Indigenous, hence why I don't say Indigenous fire stewardship. Okay, yeah. So maybe Jason, that might be a question for you as far as like governments and crews year round. I know that the FESBC operates year round.
Yeah, Garnet, I'm just having trouble with my video again, but can you hear me okay?
I can. Yep, you are live.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one you could almost pitch back to Kelsey. So, like, when we're looking at the work that we're doing, whether it's around recovering fiber that would otherwise be burned through ordinary fire abatement activities or through the WRR work that we're doing, as Kelsey already said, the literature suggests a $3 to $6 return on every dollar invested in wildfire mitigation. The impacts to especially to small rural communities from providing that full year-round employment, the socioeconomic impacts and benefits of that. I think I'm not in a position to measure those, but I know that there are people who are and would suggest that that's very impactful for communities and for the members of those communities as well. So I don't think there's any question that that the benefits are there. And the thing is, how do you tie the investments that you're making in that year-round work to things like the reduced cost of healthcare because we're getting fewer smoke emissions close to communities, to things like carbon, so that we are seeing less of that carbon go up in smoke over the course of the year. So it's about creating a case for what we already know to be true, that there are human benefits, there are local benefits, and there are environmental benefits to this work taking place.
That's great. And maybe just as a quick follow-up, Jason, for you on that response, like Stephanie's coming from the Northwest Territories, more remote communities. What's your organization's experience been with like those more rural communities, more remote? How do they get the people or the equipment or the knowledge to actually do what they need to do? Like how are you accessing those?
There is a capacity building element to this, right? The expectations are that you're not going to be able to you have to walk before you run. But at the same time, it's about building those networks. So maybe you don't have the contractors in place or the consultants in place, but you do have that local knowledge in place.
Right.
I love listening to Dane present because, like, it reminds me that there are this notion of active forest management is not something that we've just stumbled upon. This has been the norm for Canada and for any place that's been occupied by people since time immemorial. There aren't primary forests in British Columbia. There are forests that have been shaped by Indigenous practices, and that's being able to harness to tap into that knowledge, but then provide that support from outside sources. That's where you build that network that's going to be stronger than any. You're not asking people to act alone in any of this. We're providing the funding. We're connecting to the operators. We're planning at a provincial level. We're using data that's being collected by the Canadian Space Agency. Like this is how we're going to build our way out of the situation that we've created for ourselves and the way that we've managed for us for the last 150 years.
Nice. Well, thank you for that, Jason. Okay, next question comes from the person named Anonymous. Hi, Jen. Can you share your thoughts on what a fire breaks might look like in a forest management area, large-scale landscape with high fire connectivity, in the context of using forest harvesting to help break up the landscape, size, maintenance, etc., and how the forest regulatory system could support those activities? Thank you. So, Jen, over to you. Oh, and you're on mute there.
It's a great question. I think about this a lot in the context of the scope of the problem. And a lot of the solutions that we're talking about, and it's all great stuff, is really the long view. So, how do we change really foundational issues in the system and so that 20, 30, 40 years from now, it's different. The length of time that it's going to take to redesign the forests is it's not fast enough. The fires are here. So what can we do right now that could make a difference in the next 5 years? And I think the approach has to be really targeted and strategic. So not thinking about changing the age class structure, that's not going to happen fast enough to make a difference. But what we can do is, some of the tools that my group designed. So those fire pathways, for example, from the landscape into things that we care about. You can look at those prominent pathways and you could say, how in a very targeted surgical way do we create features on fuel that could be fuel removal, but very targeted features that is done strategically with like operational tactics, so firefighting tactics. So not thinking of it as a feature that's going to necessarily stop a fire, but one that agencies fighting a fire could use to ignite and burn out from as an ignition operation if a fire were to come down that path. So I think if we were targeted, those kinds of fuel breaks that are married with an operational strategy could be implemented very quickly in the most priority areas over much shorter timelines. But then also thinking, on longer term at the landscape scale, the fuel modifications are going to look different.
Nice. And Jen, I'm just curious, like with your research group, are you also looking at like scenarios where you could have, instead of catastrophic wildfire loss, but fire flow through an ecosystem instead of like a full break? Is that something that you look at as well?
Well, we look at the pathways. So we look at the ways that fire can move outwards from a possible ignition. So maybe that's power lines, for example, and how they might move into things that we care about, and that could be habitat, or it could be the built environment, or it could be critical infrastructure, and so on. So we're looking at the movement of fire and how to delineate that in really rapid assessments that you can then dig into about, okay, well, what is the strategy for containing fire or keeping it out of a certain area and cutting off pathways of that fire movement.
Thank you. Okay, so just looking at our time here, so we have quite a few more questions in the chat box. And again, Forest Products Association of Canada will put all those questions together, get them to our presenters, and they will look to roll it back out to you as participants. So at this time, we're going to shift it back to Kate Lindsay, and Kate will take us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Garnet. And thank you to all our speakers and presenters. There was a lot of kind of applause and hearts in the chat, so which is great to see. Excellent insight. And so, as mentioned, FPAC will be following up with participants from this event. We have some policy materials we can share, and if there are specific responses to some of the questions that we're not able to get to, we can happy to take those and try to provide those answers. And so before we close today, we have another very special guest that I have the privilege of introducing. And thank you so much, Gord, for participating today and for being here. And I will leave the last remarks. Please welcome Member of Parliament for Courtenay, Alberni, Gord Johns. Over to you, Gord.
Oh, thanks, Kate. It's a huge honor to be joining you today, and thanks for the invite. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin people, and just inspired by the many speakers today. And certainly, as we know, across our country, wildfire seasons are becoming longer, more intense, and more destructive. It's not a series of isolated emergencies. It's a structural shift driven by many issues. Certainly, climate change is the most driving issue, and far-reaching impacts. Wildfires are accelerating through not just with climate change, but through massive carbon emissions. That are causing huge impacts on the environment. They're driving up economic costs from infrastructure damage to insurance losses. We've heard about that today. The disruption in supply chain, something that we've seen across our country in recent years, including in my own riding on Vancouver Island, where forestry is an incredibly important employer and creates many jobs in my riding, but it's impacted all sectors. I've had two massive wildfires in the last 3 years in my riding. It's obviously degrading air quality across entire regions, affecting the health of millions of Canadians, often far from the fires themselves, and they're putting jobs at risk while destabilizing local economies. And for too long, our approach, and we've heard this time and time again today, that it's largely reactive. We mobilize when fires are out of control and rebuild after the damage is done, and that approach is insufficient. Certainly, as New Democrats and in my role as the critic for emergency preparedness in rural Canada, we've been pushing towards prevention, coordination, and long-term resilience. And we've seen some progress as of recent. We've pushed and helped secure the establishment of a national aerial firefighting fleet, ensuring faster, more coordinated response when time is critical. Also, we've helped advance the biomass tax credit, turning excess forest fuel into an asset which supports economic activity in affected regions. But that's really important. And the coordination has been another priority. We've been working alongside the Canadian Association of Fire Chiefs in advocating for strengthening alignment across jurisdictions and closing gaps that are slow to response, as Kelsey said, enhancing that. We've also helped advance progress towards doubling the volunteer firefighter and search and rescue tax credit, which is important in recognizing the role in rural and remote communities, especially. And at the same time, we heard today many important efforts need to be put in play. Obviously, we've been pushing for stronger protections and support for wildland firefighters whose working conditions must reflect the risks they face. And I want to thank all of the people involved in fire that are here today. And also, we put forward a motion, M20, which are advancing stronger mental health supports for emergency responders and affected communities, because the impacts of disasters, they simply don't end when the fire is out. And I have to acknowledge Corey, the parliamentary secretary, Corey Hogan. He's been working constructively with our party to advance these priorities. We haven't seen the federal government respond like this before, so that kind of collaboration matters, and I want to give him a shout out. Taken together, obviously, this reflects that a broader shift Canada must continue to make, from reacting to disasters to building prevention, preparedness, and resilience. And that includes investing in predictive fire modeling, supporting Indigenous fire stewardship. I really appreciated, Dane, your speech on that, and mobilizing place-based knowledge to guide forest management. And Kelsey, you talked about the Fire Smart. Well, it saved Dashwood in my community. So that's really critical. And just the tools and expertise are there. We heard that today. What's required now is sustained commitment and the willingness to build on the progress that's happening. And we've heard today, because the cost of prevention, as we've heard over and over again, is far lower than the cost of rebuilding after disaster. And obviously, I just want to thank those for the conversation today. We look forward to working with all of you on clear asks from the federal government that we can help advance. And I want to thank FPAC for the important work they're doing to advance this conversation and the work they do for the forest sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you, MP Gord-Johns. It was great to have your remarks. I'm from Vancouver Island also, so it's great to see a fellow Islander. I just as we close, I want to really extend our appreciation for everyone that spent time with us today, all of you that listened in, asked questions, and thank you so much to our presenters. A big thank you to Parliamentary Secretary Corey Hogan and P. Gord-Johns. Really helped kind of bring that federal government perspective across parties to the discussion today. And I hope what people got out of this today is that there are solutions out there. There is some amazing work being done, particularly within communities, within Indigenous fire stewardship. It's incredible, and I think we need to hear more about those. And then how do we scale up? How do we enable? What is the role of different levels of government to enable those solutions? So we have a positive impact in increasing the resilience of landscapes moving forward. And so, as I was mentioning, we will be following up with participants with some of the materials that were discussed today. We will also be, this event was recorded, and so it will be posted on FPAC's YouTube channel, so you can refer back to listen in to some of the presentations. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the FPAC team, and we will do our best to provide answers or references or resources to what you might be interested in learning